I want to ask about the difference. I watched the debate with Benny. I thought the first 2 hours were really fascinating. Benny Morris being a very reputable historian, Israeli historian, and so much of the argument came down to intent over the founders of the State of Israel. But I want to ask about the difference between liberal Zionism embodied in figures like Teddy Kollek and Shimon Peres and all these kinds of, maybe even Rabin and others, and what this religious Zionism, now Ben Gvir, and how you see that in terms of changing Israel. I mean, that kind of process. Certainly when I was in Israel, you had you had significant aspects of the Labor Party, you had a peace movement. It's a very different country, but I wonder if you could talk about that transition.
I happen to think that's an excellent question, and it's a very tough question, because right now, Israeli society has no left. It doesn't have a center. It has a right, a far right, and an ultra right. That's the whole of the Israeli spectrum. And at some level, well, for those of you who are doubtful of that characterization, I'll give you just one piece of evidence, and then you judge it on your own. If you look at the most recent opinion polls, 90% of Israelis believe that Israel is using enough or not enough force in Gaza at the moment. Fully 40% believe that Israel is using insufficient force in Gaza. Now, I find that irreconcilable with any notion of even a center in Israel, let alone a left. Now, some people make in my opinion, the extenuating argument, the alibi, that the Israeli media are biased and that's why the people, they don't know what's happening. I find that, and many respectable people say that, but I find that most implausible. Israelis have probably the highest per capita rate of usage of the web, social media, and things like that. They know what's going on. Even if their newspapers are lying, even if their television is lying, they're on the web. If I can read the London Times, if I can read The Economist, they can read the New York Times, and they can read 10,000 other outlets, which are telling more or less, okay, I leave out the New York Times, are telling more or less what's happening. But Chris, it raises a tough question, because it's true, only the oldest people in this room will remember, Israel was a left-wing cause for the longest time. I know that sounds strange to you. The head of Israel at the beginning was a party called the Mapai. It belonged to the Socialist International. The leading opposition party was the Mapam, and the Mapam were totally slavish ideologically to the Soviet Union. Israel its founding was supported by the Soviet Union. And that was true pretty much until 1977, when what was called the Likud came to power under Menachem Begin. The problem with this left-right demarcation is the ethnic cleansing of 1948, it occurred under the left. The Mapai, Mapam, the left in Israel, they were the executors of the ethnic cleansing. Or take another example. Up until Gaza, the worst bloodletting were not those periodic mowings of the lawn in Gaza. Up until, as I meant the present, the worst bloodletting, and I was just talking about with Chris beforehand, was in 1982 in Lebanon. In 1982 in Lebanon, the estimates are between 15 and 20,000. That's not a trivial number. 15 and 20,000 Palestinians and Lebanese were killed. And labor, the head of the government was Begin and Sharon, Ariel Sharon and Menachem Begin, but the Labor Party supported it. I even remember back then when a major Marxist academic named Shlomo Aveniri, some of you may remember, he's probably around 100 years old now. Shlomo Aveniri, he was supposed to appear at the Democrats' what was it called back then? It wasn't called DSA. Yeah, maybe it was called the DSA back then.
I think so.
Yeah, at their convention, and he was kicked out because he was supporting the Lebanon war. So horrible things happen under the labor governments, though it's also true to say that they weren't nearly as ideologically brazen as the current governments, but everybody knows overwhelmingly who built the settlements. It was labor. Whenever there was a switch between labor and Likud, labor, every time it came into power, it built more settlements. It built more settlements than Likud. So one place where I will acknowledge a difference is, and this is one of the reasons why I said, and I don't say it gleefully, I don't believe a diplomatic settlement is possible now. I'm not saying that with any kind of glee. I'm just trying to be factual. When you were in the era of Ehud Barak and then Ehud Olmert, that is the era of 2000 and then 2007-8, in that era, what the Palestinians and the Israelis were arguing over, they were arguing over percentages, which is to say, Israel wants to keep 80% of the settlers in the West Bank. Omar wants to keep 87% of the settlers in the West Bank. The Palestinians make an offer to keep 60% of the settlers in the West Bank. It was arguments over details and percentages. It's true they were still far apart, but there was, so to speak, a common goal. We're at the point where the current government in Israel won't even give a broom closet to the Palestinians. We're nowhere even near where things once were. So the idea when they say we're going to make two states out of what? You're going to give them 10 feet of land? 4 acres of land? What are you talking about? So at that level, I would have to say, yes, there has been a change between what was under labor and what's currently under the current government.
I want to ask about the United States. It's clearly complicit in sustaining the genocide. I think 67 or 68% of the weapons stockpiles come from the U.S. And the obsequiousness of both parties towards Israel's demands. I'm just going to quote Ariel Sharon and then have you comment. He told Shimon Peres, quote, every time we do something, you tell me Americans will do this and will do that. I want to tell you something very clear. Don't worry about American pressure on Israel. We, the Jewish people, control America, and the Americans know it.
It has been a question for many people. Why is Biden acquitting himself in the fashion that he is? And for that matter, Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and the rest. I would say there are two elements. One element is there is a strategic interest by the United States to seeing that Israel's deterrence capacity is restored after October 7th. And our administration does see Iran as a crucial regional power that has to be put in its place. And there is the fear in the US administration, from the vantage point of its own interests, there is the fear that a victory for Hamas will embolden what's called the resistance front. So that is, I think, a distinct and separate US interest. However, not a however, I would say an in addition. And here I'll freely admit to going into speculative terrain, and some people may be offended by it. It's my honest opinion, and we can argue over facts. We are obviously in an election cycle. And as everybody knows, if you open up, say, the front page of the New York Times today, the first thing they're always calculating is which party is getting more campaign contributions. And today, the Times breathed a big sigh of relief. Joe Biden is getting ahead now of Trump. I'm not sure if in just the current month or totals. I didn't read the full article. There is a Jewish billionaire class. And since October 7th, it's gone mad. That's not an exaggeration. It is impossible to find an example in American history of not one, but two Ivy League college presidents who were toppled in real time, in your face coups. The president of Harvard University was ousted from office because she was insufficiently repressive, suppressive of a speech and assembly on her campus. That's completely unprecedented. It was the grossest, most egregious, the most flagrant violation of academic freedom in our country's history. There's nothing that even compares to it. I have studied that history. I've written on that history. It was at the turn of the century, the robber barons. When I say the turn of the century, I mean from the 19th to the 20th century. The robber barons got very upset because there was a lot of labor insurgency, and there were just a handful of professors, really you can count them in the fingers of your hand, who in their university posts were expressing some support for the labor insurgencies, and the robber barons were ruthless in trying to get them expelled from the university. And that was the beginnings of the whole battle for academic freedom of our country, was the formation of the AAUP, the American Association of University Presidents. John Dewey and several others played a very important role. But this was simply breathtaking. They, without no holds barred, not behind closed doors, they toppled two Ivy League college presidents. They are that ruthless, and they have that much power. Remember, they're giving $100 million at a shot. That's an extraordinary amount of money. If there's anybody in this room from my generation, we as kids used to watch this program. It was a weekly program. It was called The Millionaire. And it was about this philanthropist who would each week, it was a weekly, he would give $1 million to some do-gooder. And we would sit in front of our TV sets and, oh my God, $1 million. It was unbelievable. It was like going to Jupiter and back. And okay, I account for inflation, and I know I'm old. Okay, a slice of pizza in my day was 15 cents, now it's $3. I get that. But $100 million is a lot of money. Or $50 million in the case of the donor to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And for Biden, that's a concern. If he says something too critical of Israel, they'll just give the money to Trump. Because Trump, they know he's an ace in the hole. He's going to do for us whatever we want on Israel. So I do think that that is a significant factor in Biden's calculation. And what they did was they tried to do a kind of good cop, bad cop. Biden sticks by Netanyahu. Chuck Schumer is cautiously critical of Israel in general and Netanyahu in particular, because each of them had a designated role in the division of labor. Biden needs to keep the billionaire class. Schumer has to appease that restive base in the Democratic Party, which is not happy with what's going on. So that's how I try to understand what Biden is doing.
Let's talk about Gaza itself. I was in Sarajevo during the war. That was 300 to 400 shells a day. That resulted in about 4 to 5 dead a day and 24 wounded a day. I juxtapose that with Gaza, where it's hundreds of wounded and dead a day. I think there's a pretty strong case to be made that the numbers released by the health ministry in Gaza are a severe undercount, given what are presumably tens of thousands of missing. And also the bombing itself, Gaza is only 5 miles wide, 20 miles long, is of such intensity that it's, from my own experience, hard to believe it's 30,000. But I want to talk about the reaction of with the exception of Yemen and the Houthis, there is really no resistance. And your parents were both, you survived the Holocaust, and your mother was in Auschwitz, right? Was that correct?
Father.
For your father. And
my mother was in Majdanek.
And so in some ways, it does replicate the Holocaust in the sense that the rest of the world does nothing. We are watching this slaughter being live streamed, and other than rhetorically, and it's worse because, of course, you have the rhetoric, but then you have the arms shipments, now largely through Cyprus, being helicoptered in, the UK, and there are some countries, Canada just announced that they'll cease sending weapons. I think the Netherlands have stopped, right? Norway, but nevertheless, it's being sustained. But I want you to because that's also that period of history you know well, to draw comparisons in terms of what we're seeing and the reaction.
I would say there are many factors in trying to make an analogy. The fact of the matter is that Hitler couldn't have done what he did without a war. He couldn't have possibly carried out the final solution had he not had the cover of a war and the fact that it was being executed, at least in theory, it was being executed, so to speak, behind closed doors. Now, if you were in the German army, if you were in the Wehrmacht, you were on the front, and 50% of the Jews were killed on the front. They weren't killed in the concentration camps. They were just lined up and shot down. So that's, in my opinion, a very thin alibi that you didn't know what was going on. But at least you can call it an alibi. You can grasp something. Here, there's no alibi. It's being done right out in the open. There's nowhere to hide in this current round. And a significant number of UN officials are saying it out loud. It took them quite a while to say it, but now they're saying it out loud. This is a genocide. Mass starvation is, if that's a cell phone, I carry my Star Trek laser, phaser, and I set it not on stun, but I set it on kill. So, which is what I tell my students. Yeah, Mao Zedong. So, in that respect, it's actually worse now because it's being just out in the open. And we have the facts, we have the figures. We don't have just the Hamas Ministry of Health. There have been 3 very systematic, stringent, exhaustive studies done, and they said the Hamas Ministry of Health numbers are right. It's not a speculative fact. Now,
I just want to say that what they record is only out of the morgues and hospitals. So that's
no, but I'm saying to the extent that we use the Hamas numbers, they've been confirmed by 3 independent, stringent studies. Now, when I was in a debate with Benny Morris and I mentioned the figure of 30,000, he said, "Oh, we could have killed 500,000 if we wanted to." I said, "That's not really true, because there's a gap that separates the wish from the deed. It's called politics. And the international community, it exists, and it puts constraints. We all wish they were much more significant, those constraints. But I said, considering what you've accomplished, when you look at the numbers, more children killed in Gaza since October than every single war zone in the world added together times 4. That's not a small achievement. More journalists killed than in all of World War II. That's not a small achievement. More medics killed than in any other conflict zone in the world in any year's time. The density of the bombing, unparalleled in the 21st century. The intensity of the bombing, it exceeds the bombing of Dresden. So, even though you haven't gotten your 500,000, I would say you're doing pretty well. As genocides go, you're doing a pretty good job. Now, some people want to say, well, the ICJ said only a plausible case of genocide. I would say, and they try to claim it's a low standard plausibility. I would say to any person in the room, if I were to say to you, there's a plausible case that you murdered your neighbor, you would take that claim pretty seriously. You wouldn't dismiss it. Well, what do you mean by plausible? No, it's just such a stupid argument. Plausible means credible. That's a pretty serious charge. What does plausible mean? let's say there's a regional athletic competition, okay? And you win the competition. It's to go on to be on the Olympic team. And you win the competition. Now, it's true. It doesn't mean you've won yet a gold, silver, or bronze medal. That's true. And it doesn't yet even mean you made the team. But if you qualified in the regional to be on the team, that's a pretty impressive achievement. So if you qualified for having committed the genocide, plausible case of genocide, I would say that's a pretty impressive achievement. So when you try to poo-poo it, yes, it's true. The Minister of Antiquities, he wanted to nuke Gaza. And that was not permissible. But that's not because they don't want to. It's the limits imposed by the international political system. What we know is they've gone as far as they want to go before they're stopped, because we know exactly what they wanted to do. It's one of those rare cases of truth in advertising. Defense Minister Gallant said, "We will not allow any food, fuel, water, electricity into Gaza." Well, it doesn't require rocket science to understand what's the consequence of that. Now you're going to say, but they're letting it in. Yeah, but go back and remember, they let it in when Biden said you have to let something in. And at this moment in time, they're not letting it in. Starvation is being used as a weapon. So, all things said, I would say they're doing a very good job if their goal is a genocide.
Well, they cut the humanitarian aid shipments last month by 44%.
Yeah, between the ICJ opinion and now the amount of the ICJ opinion, International Court of Justice opinion, one of the two provisional requirements imposed on Israel was to allow more humanitarian aid to get in. In fact, it was reduced by half between February and March. And that's just going to, I forgot, I want to just say one last part. I talked to the bleak part of the present picture. There are some extraordinarily inspiring things. Number one, the incredible courage, tenacity, conscientiousness of the young people who have been coming out day in and day out in support of the people of Gaza. It's absolutely breathtaking. I figure at some point it'll get boring, people will move on, and the young people keep coming out and coming out and coming out. I went to a demonstration about 2 weeks ago. It was at NYU, New York University, in Washington Square Park. It was pouring rain. And I see you two. But I didn't see anybody over 25 there, but there were umbrellas, so it was a little, I was like grandma in Munchkinland. And it was a Saturday. It was pouring rain. We started at 12, we ended at 5:30. And you know what? We then went, or a large number of us, descended into the subway. It ended at New York Public Library at 42nd Street. And on one side of the train platform and on the other side, they were still shouting, still all the energy level. And I remember I was with somebody and he said to me, and you know, they have no stake in this. They get no gain. There's no gain. You know the expression, of course you know it, of your generation, friends with benefits? This was solidarity without benefits. It was really a deeply inspiring thing. A second data point is South Africa. When people were talking about invoking the Genocide Convention, I said, oh, forget it. What are you talking about? What state is going to come to defense of Gaza in the face of the United States? That's ridiculous. And the South African performance has just been breathtaking. I don't know how many of you have read the application they submitted, the original application. It was 84 pages with literally hundreds of footnotes. It was so exhaustively and impressively documented. They must have had a very large team of people produce that document. And they continue. I don't know how many of you follow. Literally every 3 weeks, they're back at the ICJ demanding that the ICJ do more. And they have all the footnoted documents. Israel just released its response 2 days ago, and Israel was bristling now at South Africa. You're getting out of hand. They should be worried about being nuked also, I'm afraid. And the third thing, which was totally, I always freely admit to when I'm wrong because I like to be wrong for a good cause. When people ask, how do you think it's going to go in the International Court of Justice? I said, maybe you could squeak by an 8-7 vote. That's the most. And I didn't believe it. I thought it would be 6-4 and 6-4 and the rest against. And lo and behold, the vote turned out to be 15-2. The US was the president of the court, Donahue, and she voted with the majority. How do you explain that? You know, there was a song in the 1960s, famous song, "There's Something Happening Here." And when 15 judges in the ICJ vote to say Israel is plausibly guilty of genocide, and the American judge, the president, goes along with that, that's pretty impressive. As an indicator of things, and I'll freely say, if there were a Nobel laureate, if there were a Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, to be given out now, first and foremost, I would give it to the doctors in Gaza. So many of them from abroad volunteered to go there. A death zone. That's very impressive. Could I have done that? I would feel the moral pressure, but I think the fear would get the better of me. Second, I would give it to the South Africa delegation. And third, I would give it to the Houthis. I'm not saying that as a throwback to my days as a Maoist. I'm saying that as a human being. Remember, in the 1990s, there was this whole doctrine which was propagated by liberals, like the Samantha Powers type. It was called responsibility to protect, R2P. Well, what are the Houthis doing? The idea was you have a responsibility to protect people who are being threatened with genocide. Isn't that what the Houthis are doing? Protecting, they are fulfilling their responsibility to protect. The Genocide Convention says every signatory has a responsibility to prevent genocide. That's what the Houthis are doing. So, now you might ask why they're doing it. You can speculate, but I think there's one very good reason why they're doing it. You know why? Because what's happening to Gaza happened to them. Between 2015 and 2018, because of the Saudi US-backed blockade, about 80,000 Yemenis starved to death. They understand starvation. So they would be the third, in my opinion, recipients of that prize.
So we're going to open to questions. Keep them short. Don't give speeches, please.
Yeah, so turns out that we'll probably have to exit this building in about 20 minutes because campus security kind of wants us out here by then. So what we're going to do is raise your hand. Yeah, raise your hand if you want to ask a question. I'll come over and get to you.
Young man, I'd like to call on him first. This fellow in the back, if you don't mind.
Okay, gotcha. Also, after I ask this question, second floor will get their own question, and third floor will get their own question, and I think that'll be pretty much it for tonight. So, yeah.
Okay. I totally support the Houthis as a Jew. You said that, Norm.
Yeah,
The
totally.
Houthi flag says, "God is the greatest, death to America, death to Israel, a curse upon the Jews, victory to Islam."
Yes, I'm aware of
How do you
that.
reconcile this?
I have no problem reconciling it for this very simple reason, and you'll allow me, you can disagree, I have no problem with that. From my first conscious moments in my own life, okay, my parents loathed the Germans. They didn't loathe the Nazis. They hated the Germans. In fact, I vividly recall my father once recommended me a book on the Nazi Holocaust. And I asked him, what makes this book special? And he said to me, I liked it that the author didn't talk about Nazis. He talked about Germans. Now, my parents were very decent human beings. The apple did not fall far from the tree. But I could understand that sentiment. The only Jews the Houthis have known are the Israelis. It's a regrettable fact that they don't know, have never experienced any other kinds of Jews. I remember I once asked my mother, just out of curiosity, did you ever come into contact with a German who was decent? And she said to me, she thought hard, and she said, I remember one German soldier, he had a kind of guilty look on his face. That was all she could remember, one. So it doesn't surprise me that she loathed all Germans. Do I wish the Houthis were more discriminating in their slogans? Of course I wish it. But do I understand where it comes from? Yes. And will that slogan of theirs color my appreciation of the fact that alone among the world's peoples, they are resorting to armed force to stop the genocide in Gaza? I have to ask myself the question, how would my parents have felt if this ragtag army happened to be situated on a point in the world's map where they could inflect the outcome of the final solution? And these people, this ragtag people, hailing back to the Middle Ages, they were investing all of their physical resources and moral energy to stopping the extermination. How would my parents react? Would they ask, what are their political slogans? I don't think so. That's my honest reaction. I'm not trying to be rhetorical with you. You asked me a concrete question, that's how I reasoned it through.
And we should be clear that that blockade, that blockade that the Houthis have imposed is circumvented by the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, which has created a land corridor to supply Israel with its vacuum cleaners and consumer goods. Next question.
Yes, please do.
In your characteristically slow and pointed speech pattern, Yisrael Chai.
I don't understand the relationship of those two statements, but okay. Mm-hmm. I want to speak honestly to you. If it does go somewhere, and I do believe a problem is lurking now, if it does go somewhere, it's of your own making. You've gone too far. They said already, a book I wrote in 2008, the title was taken by something written by Gideon Levy, referring to Operation Cast Lead. And the title was, This Time We've Gone Too Far. And Cast Lead is now a pale, pale, pale comparison to what's happened to the people of Gaza. And I don't say it with glee. I'm just saying, if you do go somewhere, it's of your own making.
Well, and there are Israeli moral philosophers like Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who warned Israel precisely. The self-destructive path that it was on. So we have any more questions? Oh, good. One question. So just raise your hand and they'll bring the mic to you. Down here. Over here.
Thank you for that response. I was wondering if you can talk to the fact that that response has to be, in order for it to be powerful and legit, it has to come from a Jewish standpoint. And I wanted to ask you what could be possible for those who do not have that experience to respond back to the Houthis and supporting the Houthis. So what kind of response do you imagine could be possible from another standpoint that does not fall into that kind of deadlock of how come you're supporting the Houthis?
I think it's simply a fact of life that certain persons have certain kinds of, I won't call it immunities, but they have certain kinds of what you might call rhetorical privileges, which others don't have. And I want to be judged by the facts. And if you disagree with me, you're free to disagree with me. And I would hope that beyond disagreeing with me, you will make an argument and not just a slogan. But I also recognize that I can't say my life has been exemplary of immunities. On the other hand, I recognize that I am able to, in public at any rate, make arguments that the two young women sitting in the front row now are not able to make and who are more easily dismissed. And I don't think you can get around that. It's just, so to speak, the nature of things. You're choosing? I think we need to.
We need the mic.
I see he has a mic back
Yeah.
here.
So go ahead. Oh, there.
So I'm filled with emotions. I'm from Gaza. I'm from Khan Yunis. 45 people from my family have been killed on Friday morning, 6 a.m. After the morning prayer, my nephew, 17 years old, was killed in a tent that is in the safe area that was designated by Israel after they were driven out of their town. And other people were injured. So just going back to the Houthis, I don't understand why whoever is asking a question about the Houthis, they're not outraged about what Israel has done and is doing. If they were outraged about that, they wouldn't even see the Houthis as a problem. Because the main problem in the Middle East right now is what is Israel and what it's doing. Israel is the one who's killing. Israel is the one who's bombing. Israel is the one who's doing everything that is against civilization, destroying hospitals, schools, universities, houses, villages, cutting trees, doing everything unimaginable. And we're still asking about what the Houthis are doing. What are the Houthis are doing? What are they? They're just stopping some ships from passing through the sea, and the ships are going to support a genocide. How big of a problem is that compared to what Israel is doing? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll go middle here and then left side next, if that's okay with all of you. Okay. Oh, yeah. Sure.
Could you talk about the ICJ and why that decision had so little impact in the grand scheme of things?
Why that decision had so little impact? I can't really agree with that because legal opinions and legal decisions, unless you have force behind them, they're basically weapons in a political or ideological struggle. And that was a very powerful weapon that the ICJ handed to the solidarity movement with the people of Gaza. The fact that I said earlier, Israel was facing a legitimation crisis, the fact that Israel now has pinned on it the scarlet letter of genocide has radically, or potentially, will radically reshape opinions of Israel. They're going to have to carry that with them, that they were plausibly accused of a genocide. And that's, for us, it legitimates. Or let me just put it to you in reverse. Many people were worried if the ICJ had voted in reverse, namely, there is no plausible case of genocide. That would have been a political disaster. Israel would have won 99% of the propaganda war, or the war for a public relations war. So that fear was not only dispelled, but now you had a very potent weapon in the quiver of those struggling for justice, that the highest judicial body in the world, the president at the time of which was an American, had said, well, we looked at the evidence, there's a plausible case for genocide here.
It's an existential issue, as Norman laid out in his book, The Holocaust Industry, because Israel has weaponized the Holocaust, weaponized the genocide that was carried out against Jews, and this ruling potentially removes that protection. I just want to quickly highlight that it's not just genocide, but within the United States, there are 5 laws that every day the State Department is violating as it approves ships and cargo planes full of weapons. The Foreign Assistance Act, which forbids the provision of assistance to a government which engages in a consistent pattern of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. The Arms Export Control Act, which says countries that receive U.S. military aid can only use weapons for legitimate self-defense and internal security. The U.S. War Crimes Act, which forbids grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, including the willful torture, killing, or inhuman treatment. The Leahy Law, which prohibits the U.S. government from using funds for assistance to units of foreign security forces where there is credible information implicating that unit in the commission of gross violations of human rights. And the Genocide Convention Implementation Act, which was enacted to implement U.S. obligations under the Genocide Convention, and Israel would push for that, and provides for criminal penalties for individuals who commit or incite others to commit genocide. So what is happening is a grotesque violation of not only international law, but domestic law. And I think that this is this refusal. I know in the debate, Benny Morris was saying, well, the laws don't matter, laws don't matter. Well, laws do matter, because if we don't have any kind of legal mechanism by which we can restrain these forces, then we create a kind of Hobbesian world. And I think that is, I'm very, as some of you know, very close to Julian Assange and just came back from the hearing in London. And one of the things that terrifies me, having sat through those hearings in London, is the way the British legal system and the American legal system is ignoring its own laws. And this sets a kind of precedence that is very, very dangerous. So yeah, the law does matter. And I found that an interesting kind of exchange between you and Benny, because he was essentially saying it doesn't.
Well, Professor Morris says the laws don't matter, or law doesn't matter, when it all depends on whose ox is being ground. So on October 7th, if you really truly believe that international law is an irrelevance, if you believe that, then Hamas did nothing wrong on October 7th. Because the wrongness of its deed springs from the fact that international humanitarian law, IHL as it's called, distinguishes between civilians and combatants. It's what's called the most fundamental principle of IHL, international humanitarian law. The fundamental principle is the principle of distinction. You have to distinguish between civilians and combatants, civilian sites and military sites. But if you don't believe in the law, as I said to Benny Morris, Professor Morris, then don't complain about what happened on October 7th. You can't have it both ways. The law only becomes operative when you are the victim, but becomes inoperative when you are the perpetrator.
Thank you. I think it was like in February 15 or something like that, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, he said something along the lines that the waterfront properties in Gaza are going to be very valuable, and he also recommended, to get people out of there and clean it. Do you think that that will give us an idea of what a potential second-term policies for Trump are going to be?
Well, Jared Kushner is an example of why we have to get rid of affirmative action for rich people. No. He's a terrifying imbecile, and he went to Harvard because of his father, who's a sick crook, got him into, I think the only good thing Chris Christie ever did was lock up his father. It was, beyond all else, it was just so stupid to be...
I'm so sorry, but we are at time right now, and we're gonna have to close out. I don't want to interrupt you. I really hate doing this, but we have to. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Okay.
The campus security.
I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for watching The Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work. So please tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to The Real News Network. Solidarity forever.